Before the world knew liberation, before chains were broken and seas were parted, there was a single moment, quiet and desperate, on the edge of a river. A mother. A basket. A choice that would alter the course of human history forever. This is not a legend. This is not mythology. This is the story Scripture preserved across millennia, a story of impossible odds, divine timing, and a God who sees even the child the world has tried to erase. This is the origin of Moses. To understand the man, you must first understand the darkness he was born into. Egypt, in the ancient world, was not merely a nation. It was the most powerful empire on the face of the earth, a civilization of towering monuments, absolute rulers, and gods carved from stone. And at its heart sat Pharaoh, a man who believed himself to be divine. A man who looked out over his kingdom and saw, among his workforce of enslaved people, a group growing too numerous, too strong, too dangerous to ignore. The Bible is precise about this moment. In the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 8, Scripture says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph." Exodus 1 verse 8. Those words carry the full weight of tragedy. Because Joseph, the Hebrew patriarch who had saved Egypt from famine generations before, was now forgotten. His people, the Israelites, who had come to Egypt as honored guests under Joseph's protection, had become slaves. And Pharaoh, gazing upon their increasing numbers, felt not gratitude, but fear. Exodus chapter 1, verses 9 and 10 record his chilling words to his people, "Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply." Exodus 1 verses 9 to 10. And so the machinery of oppression was set in motion. The Israelites were forced into brutal labor, building cities, hauling stone, mixing mortar under the unrelenting Egyptian sun. The Bible describes their condition in Exodus chapter 1, verse 14, "They made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field." Exodus 1 verse 14. But labor alone did not slow the growth of the Hebrew people. They multiplied still. And a king ruled by fear does not stop at labor. He reaches for something darker. Pharaoh summoned the Hebrew midwives, women named Shiphrah and Puah, and issued an order so monstrous it silences the room even now, thousands of years later. Every Hebrew boy born was to be killed at birth. Every son. Every future. Every hope. Yet here, in the very first act of divine resistance in this story, those two midwives did something extraordinary. They feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. Exodus chapter 1, verses 17 records, "But the midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive." Exodus 1 verse 17. When confronted by Pharaoh, they gave him an answer. And the Bible tells us God rewarded their courage, He gave them families of their own, Exodus 1 verse 21. But Pharaoh was not deterred. His decree expanded. No longer a whispered command to midwives, now it was public, absolute, and terrifying. Exodus chapter 1, verse 22 records the proclamation that turned the Nile itself into an instrument of death, "Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive." Exodus 1 verse 22. Into this world of iron chains, stolen sons, and a river that swallowed futures, a child was about to be born. A child his mother would look upon and see something she could not explain, something that made her refuse, at the cost of everything, to let him go. Into this world of darkness, of grief pressed into every Hebrew home, of mothers who learned to silence their newborns' cries for fear of soldiers at the door, into this world, a woman of the tribe of Levi gave birth to a son. The Bible does not dramatize the moment with elaborate description. It does not need to. The weight of what this birth meant is carried entirely in the simplicity of what Scripture records next. Exodus chapter 2, verse 2 states, "And the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months." Exodus 2 verse 2. That word, beautiful, has stirred scholars and theologians for centuries. The original Hebrew word used is tov, the same word God spoke over creation in Genesis. Good. It was good. As though even in the darkest corner of human suffering, this mother looked at her son and saw something that carried the fingerprint of the divine. His name, at this point in the narrative, is not yet given. He is simply a child. A Hebrew son. A life that Pharaoh's law had already condemned before his first breath had fully settled in his lungs. His mother's name, we learn later from scripture, was Jochebed, Numbers 26:59. His father, Amram. And they were not strangers to faith, they were descendants of Levi, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, the patriarchs of Israel. Faith was in their lineage. But faith, in this moment, was being tested in the most primal way a parent can be tested. For 3 months, Jochebed hid her son. 3 months of whispered lullabies. 3 months of pressing a hand gently over a crying mouth in the dead of night. 3 months of watching the door, listening for footsteps, praying that heaven would hold the secret she could not keep forever. The New Testament later honors what she did in those desperate months. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23 says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command." Hebrews 11 verse 23. Not afraid of the king's command. Those words are staggering when you hold them against the reality of what Pharaoh's command meant. These were not people with power. They were enslaved. They had no legal protection, no political voice, no army at their back. And yet, faith made them unafraid. But 3 months is a long time to hide a living, breathing, growing child. And the moment came, as Jochebed must have known it would, when hiding him inside the home was no longer possible. What she did next is one of the most quietly devastating acts of love recorded in all of Scripture. She built him a boat. Not a grand vessel. Not something built with resources she did not have. Exodus chapter 2, verse 3 describes it with heartbreaking specificity, but when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. Exodus 2 verse 3. Bulrushes. Reeds from the riverbank. Sealed with tar and pitch to keep the water out. A mother's hands, pressing waterproofing into the cracks of a basket, knowing that when she was finished, she would place her son inside it and let the river decide what she could not. The same river Pharaoh had turned into an instrument of death, she was now trusting it with her son's life. There is no recorded prayer here. No angelic visitation. No burning bush, no voice from heaven. Just a mother, a basket, and the mercy she was casting upon the waters along with everything she loved. But she did not walk away entirely. Exodus chapter 2, verse 4 tells us, "And his sister stood afar off, to know what would be done to him." Exodus 2 verse 4. His sister, later identified in Scripture as Miriam, Numbers 26:59, stood at a distance and watched. A child herself, standing guard over a secret hidden in the reeds, watching the basket that held her brother's life bob gently on the surface of the Nile. This detail matters. Because Miriam's presence at that riverbank was not accidental. What was about to happen next would require her voice, her courage, and her quick thinking. God was already positioning people before the miracle arrived. The basket drifted. The reeds held it close to shore. And then, footsteps. Voices. The sound of women approaching the river. Heaven was about to intervene from the most unexpected direction imaginable. The women who approached the riverbank that morning did not come in secret. They came with attendance, with presence, with the unmistakable authority of royalty. Because among them walked a woman whose identity would make every Hebrew heart stop cold with fear. Pharaoh's daughter. The very daughter of the man who had signed the death warrant of every Hebrew son now walked toward the water's edge, toward the reeds where a basket was hiding the child that decree was meant to destroy. The irony is so profound, so perfectly constructed, that no human storyteller could have engineered it. This was something else entirely. Exodus chapter 2, verse 5 records the moment with calm, cinematic precision. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. And her maidens walked along the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. Exodus 2 verse 5. She saw it. Among all the reeds, among all the shadows along that riverbank, her eyes were drawn to it. She sent someone to retrieve it. And when the basket was opened, Scripture captures what happened next in a single, devastating sentence. Exodus chapter 2, verse 6, and when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. Exodus 2 verse 6. He wept. Not a decree, not a miracle of fire, not a voice from the sky, just the cry of an infant. And that cry reached something in the heart of a princess that her father's coldness had never extinguished. The Bible continues, so she had compassion on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Exodus 2 verse 6. She knew. She looked at this child, hidden in a basket of reeds, sealed with pitch, left at the river's edge, and she understood immediately what she was holding. A Hebrew boy. A child her father's law had condemned. And she chose compassion anyway. This is the moment Miriam had been waiting for. Standing at a distance, heart pounding, watching the princess hold her brother, the young girl stepped forward with a boldness that defies her age and circumstance. Exodus chapter 2, verse 7 records her words, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" Exodus 2 verse 7. It is a masterwork of courage disguised as helpfulness. Miriam did not reveal who she was. She did not betray that she knew this child. She simply offered a solution, and Pharaoh's daughter accepted. What happened next is perhaps one of the most tender reversals in all of human history. Miriam ran. She ran back to the home where a mother sat in the particular agony of a woman who has just surrendered the thing most precious to her. And she brought Jochebed, the very mother who had built that basket, who had sealed it with her own hands, who had placed her son upon the Nile with nothing but faith, back to the princess. Exodus chapter 2, verse 8, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." Exodus 2 verses 8 to 9. Read that again. Pharaoh's daughter handed the Hebrew child back to his own mother. And not only that, she promised to pay her to care for him. The mother who had surrendered her son to the river now held him again, legally protected by the crown of Egypt, compensated for loving her own child. God had not simply saved the boy. He had restored him to his mother's arms and made the empire of his oppressor finance his upbringing. This is the signature of divine intervention, not just deliverance, but redemption so complete it transforms the very instrument of suffering into a vehicle of grace. The child grew. Jochebed nursed him, held him, sang over him, and one can only imagine what she whispered to him in those sacred hidden hours. Did she tell him who he was? Did she breathe into him the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Did she pray over him in the tongue of his enslaved people, even as the palace of Egypt waited for him just beyond the horizon? Scripture does not record those private moments. But it records the one that followed them. Exodus chapter 2, verse 10, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." Exodus 2 verse 10. Moses. From the Egyptian, drawn out. Pulled from the water. Named by a princess who should have been his enemy, raised in a palace that should have been his grave. But names, in Scripture, are never accidental. Because this man who was drawn out of the water would one day draw an entire nation out of something far deeper than a river. He would draw them out of 400 years of bondage. Out of slavery. Out of silence. But that calling was still years away. And before Moses could become the deliverer, he would first have to become lost. He grew up inside the most powerful palace on earth. He ate at tables set for royalty. He walked corridors lined with the spoils of empire. He was educated, as the New Testament later confirms, in the full breadth of Egyptian knowledge and culture. Acts chapter 7, verse 22 records, "And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and deeds." Acts 7 verse 22. By every outward measure, Moses had everything. Power. Position. Protection. The name of Pharaoh's household covered him like armor. He wanted for nothing that the greatest civilization of the ancient world could provide. And yet, there is something that education cannot silence. Something that royal comfort cannot anesthetize. It is the knowledge of who you truly are, and for Moses, that knowledge lived just beyond the palace walls, in the bent backs and bleeding hands of a people who shared his blood. Exodus chapter 2, verse 11 captures the turning point with quiet intensity. "Now it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens." Exodus 2 verse 11. He went out. He chose to look. That choice, so simple in its language, so seismic in its consequence, tells us everything about who Moses was becoming. He could have stayed within the palace. He could have turned away. But he went out to his brethren and he looked at their burdens. And what he saw broke something open inside him. An Egyptian taskmaster was beating a Hebrew slave. One man with authority raising his hand against another man who had none. Moses looked around, confirming in both directions that no witness remained, and then scripture records what he did. Exodus chapter 2, verse 12, "So he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand." Exodus 2 verse 12. The Bible does not offer moral commentary here. It does not pause to justify or condemn. It simply records the act, and the concealment. And in that concealment, we see not the confidence of a man certain of his righteousness, but the fear of a man who already sensed he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The following day, Moses went out again. And this time he saw something that cut even deeper. Two Hebrew men were fighting each other. He intervened, asking the one in the wrong why he was striking his companion. The man's response was sharp and revealing. Exodus chapter 2, verse 14, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Exodus 2 verse 14. The secret was out. Moses felt it immediately, the ground shifting beneath his feet. Exodus chapter 2, verse 14 continues, "So Moses feared and said, Surely this thing is known." Exodus 2 verse 14. And it was. Pharaoh heard what had happened. And the man who had once sheltered Moses within his household now sought to kill him. In a single day, Moses lost everything. His position. His protection. His identity as a son of the palace. He fled Egypt with nothing but his life, crossing the wilderness toward the land of Midian, a man between worlds, belonging fully to neither. He was no longer Egyptian royalty. He was not yet Israel's deliverer. He was simply a fugitive, alone in the desert, carrying the weight of an act he could not undo and an identity he could not yet fully claim. But God had not forgotten him. God never forgets the people he has marked. In Midian, Moses sat down by a well, and once again, Scripture places him at the intersection of water and destiny. A group of women came to draw water for their father's flock, and when local shepherds drove them away, Moses rose and defended them, drawing water for their animals himself. Exodus 2 verse 17. It is a small moment. But it reveals something enduring in Moses. Even stripped of palace power, even alone and afraid, he could not witness injustice without responding to it. That impulse was not Egyptian training. It was something God had placed within him long before any education refined it. The women's father, a priest of Midian named Reuel, also called Jethro, invited Moses into his home. Moses accepted. He settled among them. He married Jethro's daughter Zipporah. She bore him a son, whom Moses named Gershom, saying, "I have been a stranger in a foreign land." Exodus 2 verse 22. Gershom. Stranger. That name was Moses naming his own condition, a man displaced, a man between the life he had lost and the purpose he had not yet found. He spent years in that wilderness. Tending flocks. Living quietly. The palace of Egypt must have seemed like another lifetime. The cries of his enslaved people, a sound he could no longer hear but surely could not forget. And then Exodus chapter 2 records something that changes the entire atmosphere of the narrative. Verses 23 through 25, Now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. Exodus 2 verses 23 to 25. 4 verbs. For movements of heaven toward earth. God heard. God remembered. God looked. God acknowledged. The people of Israel had been crying for generations. And now, in the silence of a Midian wilderness, beside a man tending sheep who had no idea what was coming, heaven was preparing to answer. A shepherd was about to meet a burning bush. And the world would never be the same. The morning began like every other morning in Midian. The sun rose over the wilderness. The flocks moved slowly across the dry earth. And Moses, former prince of Egypt, fugitive, shepherd, stranger, led the animals deeper into the wilderness, to the far side of the desert, to a place called Horeb. The Bible calls it the mountain of God, Exodus 3 verse 1. Not because Moses knew it as such in that moment. But because Scripture, written from the perspective of what that mountain would become, already knew what was waiting there. And then Moses saw it. Exodus chapter 3, verse 2, And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Exodus 3 verse 2. It burned. But it did not burn up. The fire consumed nothing. The bush remained whole, alive, untouched by the very flames that engulfed it. Moses stood still and watched, and then made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Exodus chapter 3, verse 3, Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. Exodus 3 verse 3. He turned aside. He chose to draw closer rather than retreat. And that turning, that single step toward the inexplicable rather than away from it, was the moment everything changed. Because God was waiting for exactly that. Exodus chapter 3, verse 4, So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Exodus 3 verse 4. His name. Spoken twice. With the intimacy of someone who has known you since before you knew yourself. Moses had spent decades wondering who he was, Egyptian or Hebrew, prince or shepherd, deliverer or fugitive. And now a voice from a burning bush was speaking his name as though it had always known him, as though every year in that wilderness had simply been preparation for this moment. God told him to remove his sandals, for the ground on which he stood was holy, Exodus 3 verse 5. And then he spoke words that carried the full thunder of covenant and calling. Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians. Exodus 3 verses 7 to 8. I have seen. I have heard. I know their sorrows. In those three declarations, 400 years of silence were broken. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who had made covenant promises to a people now buried under the weight of empire, was announcing that he had never looked away. Not once. Not for a single moment of their suffering. And then came the commission. Exodus chapter 3, verse 10, Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Exodus 3 verse 10. Moses, the baby left to die on the river. Moses, the prince who lost everything. Moses, the shepherd who had spent years believing his story was finished. God looked at all of that and said, I will send you. But Moses was not immediately ready to receive what God was offering. And here, in his hesitation, we find perhaps the most human moment in his entire story. Exodus chapter 3, verse 11, But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Exodus 3 verse 11. Who am I? It is the question of every person who has ever stood at the edge of a calling that feels too large for them. Who am I, a man who failed, a man who fled, a man who has been tending sheep in the wilderness for 40 years? Who am I to stand before the most powerful ruler on earth and demand the liberation of an enslaved nation? God's answer did not come as a resume of Moses' qualifications. It did not list his palace education, his physical strength, or his years of experience. God's answer was the only answer that has ever truly silenced that question. Exodus chapter 3, verse 12, So he said, I will certainly be with you. Exodus 3 verse 12. Not, you are capable. Not, you are qualified. Simply, I will be with you. The sufficiency was never going to be Moses. It was always going to be God's. Moses asked for God's name. And God gave him one that has echoed across every generation of faith since that morning on the mountain. Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Exodus 3 verse 14. I am. Not I was. Not I will be. I am, present tense, eternal, immediate, here. The God who existed before Egypt was built. The God who would remain long after its monuments turned to dust. The God who had watched a mother seal a basket with tar and pitch and float her son on a river, and had guided every current since. And so the circle closes with breathtaking completeness. The child who was supposed to die in the Nile would return to Egypt not as a victim, not as a fugitive, but as the voice of I am. The baby the river was meant to swallow would command a greater body of water to open wide and swallow an army instead. Every wound in Moses' story, his displacement, his exile, his years of wandering, had not been wasted. They had been woven. The desert had not hidden him from his purpose. It had been preparing him for it. The wilderness taught him the terrain he would one day lead a nation through. The loneliness taught him dependence. The failure taught him humility. And humility, Scripture would later declare of Moses himself, was the very quality that made him unlike any other. Numbers chapter 12, verse 3, Now the man Moses was very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth. Numbers 12:3. The baby left to die became the man God chose to speak to face, as a man speaks to his friend, Exodus 33 verse 11. There is something the story of Moses refuses to let us forget. That the people history overlooks, the lives the powerful seek to extinguish, the children cast upon rivers of desperation, these are not footnotes. They are not accidents. They are often the very people through whom heaven chooses to rewrite the story of the world. Jochebed built a basket when she had nothing else to offer. And God built a deliverer inside it. The river that was meant to end Moses carried him exactly where he needed to go. And the burning bush that should have turned to ash kept burning, just as the story of this man, this child, this prophet without equal, keeps burning still.